Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Indigenous removal from their ancestral homelands and the Trail of Tears. So questions to consider as you go through this video. What is the Indian Removal Act? What are the ways Indigenous groups both resisted white settlement and assimilated to European culture? We're going to see that there are Indigenous groups that do try to assimilate into white society. What is the Trail of Tears? And then finally, what are the consequences of Indian removal on Indigenous communities? On this slide, we have key terms. Make sure you sort of keep an eye out for these as we go through the video. They are in blue, bolded, and underlined. So to start us off, this is a map of the North American colonies before the American Revolution. So we see that the British, after they win the 7 Years' War in North America, they establish a border of the colonies at the Appalachian Mountains. This is called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And one of the reasons that the British do that is because they are concerned about Indigenous conflict with colonists. So they do set up this Indian Reserve, as they called it, west of the Appalachian Mountains, sort of to the Mississippi River, sort of hoping to alleviate some of that conflict. But once the United States wins the American Revolution, and thus all of the British land in North America up to Canada, we're going to see that the United States' policy is not to sort of keep a buffer between the colonies and Indigenous communities. It is to take over the land on which those Indigenous communities live. So Indigenous communities sort of before 1830, they're sort of trying to figure out how to sort of get along with these United States who are so concerned about expanding. So we're going to see various indigenous groups trying to adjust their alliances with Europeans, with other nations, and with the United States, really trying to limit migration west and trying to keep some of those ancestral homelands in their possession. But what we're going to see is that almost immediately after the end of the American Revolution, we see colonists and now Americans trying to move west. They are moving into the Northwest Territory. They are moving sort of across that Appalachian line, that Proclamation Line of 1763. We're going to see that the Iroquois Nation, they're forced onto reservations in New York and Pennsylvania. Eastern Woodlands American Indians are forced westward, and they come into increasing conflict with nations west of the Mississippi as they're sort of forced farther and farther west. But we also do see that there are some communities, some southeastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Creek, and the Chickasaw, are all starting to assimilate to European culture. They are starting to adapt some aspects of European culture. They are beginning to assimilate. And these tribes are known as the 5 civilized nations. And what's important to note is they occupy a lot of land in what would become Georgia, North and South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, all land that is very much coveted by the United States to settle with Americans. So we are going to take a quick look at the Cherokee Nation, who did take many steps to try and assimilate into European culture. We see that they're going to write a constitution similar to the United States' constitution. They've established sort of an agricultural economy, which is something that Jefferson really sort of pushed for. He wanted the United States to sort of be this agrarian society that's sort of really built on agriculture. But the Cherokee Nation sat on very valuable land in Georgia. It was good farmland, and there was also gold that was found. So there are lots of steps taken to try and take that land for the United States because it is seen as very valuable. And even though the Cherokee really tried to assimilate, they were not accepted by white society. And so even though we do see that there is some assimilation, we also see that there's a lot of resistance to westward expansion. We see that the Western Confederacy really opposed American settlers' expansion westward. And this is where we sort of see at the Battle of Fallen Timbers that Indigenous communities are sort of forced to abandon the British allies who had sort of helped them. And the Treaty of Greenville, which sort of ended this conflict, sort of cleared 2/3 of Ohio and Indiana of American Indian Nation, sort of again forcing them westward. We see that the Shawnee Confederation was a very large group. It included all nations east of the Mississippi. And that Shawnee Confederation sort of did a really good job at resisting that settlement, at least until the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. And the goal of the Battle of Tippecanoe was to sort of wipe out this Shawnee Confederacy, to wipe out this resistance, to sort of pave the way for white settlement in this area. And it was successful. The Battle of Tippecanoe really did end the threat of conflict between indigenous groups and white settlers in the Northwest Territories. And then finally, there is a faction or a small group of the Creek Nation called the Red Sticks that argued against accommodation of white settlers. The Creek had traditionally sort of been a little more accommodating, sort of thinking that that was a way that they could keep some of their land. But this group, the Red Sticks, were very much against that, and they launched a preliminary campaign of resistance at Fort Mims, sort of near Mobile, Alabama, and this attack ended up killing 400 Americans. We see future President Andrew Jackson retaliated by attacking a Creek village and killing 300 Indigenous warriors in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and this is still considered the largest American Indian massacre in U.S. history. So once Andrew Jackson became president, he started to look for ways to get a lot of that valuable land that had been part of that Indian Reserve prior to the American Revolution. And he proposed sort of forcibly removing those groups and moving them into what he called Indian Territory, which is most of all of modern-day Oklahoma. And the federal government would sort of fund negotiation of treaties that would force these groups to move west. And what we will see is that more than 100,000 American Indians are forcibly uprooted and moved in the 1830s. Andrew Jackson did not think that indigenous groups could assimilate. He did not value their own unique and valuable cultures, and so he took steps to remove those nations from their ancestral homelands. So what we're going to see on this map is there are quite a few different nations that are forcibly removed from the Florida territory, from parts of Georgia and North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and then even in the Northwest territories like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and then what would become Michigan and Wisconsin. So we start to see that groups that had already been displaced by the by European settlement in North America are continually pushed farther and farther west. And we see Indian Territory is sort of right here again in what is now modern day Oklahoma. So there was resistance to Indian removal. We do see a lot of groups fight back against these policies, try to stay on their ancestral homeland. Most notably, we see the Black Hawk War, the Sauk and Fox nations in Illinois and Wisconsin are led by Chief Black Hawk, and they sort of stayed and tried to resist that forced westward expansion. And this war sort of crushed almost immediately by U.S. troops. And this leaves that area west of Lake Michigan to become open for white settlement. We see the Second Seminole War. The Seminoles are probably the group that was able to resist the most successfully. Seminoles were sort of ordered by the U.S. to merge with their traditional enemy, the Creek, and relocate to Indian Territory. The Seminole sort of and the Creek had long-standing conflict with each other. Many Seminoles had escaped Creek slavery, so asking these two groups to sort of basically move in together in Indian Territory was sort of cause for alarm. And we see that the Second Seminole War leaves 1,500 U.S. soldiers dead over the course of that war. And this sort of persistent and active resistance let some Seminoles stay in their home. We see 3,000 are forcibly removed to Oklahoma, but the government does allow some to remain in South Florida. And so we do see that of those 5 civilized nations, as they were called, we see that the Seminole are the most successful in resisting this forced removal. And the Cherokee actually pursued justice through the United States legal system. So the Cherokee take 2 different cases to the Supreme Court in the hopes of keeping their homeland. In the first, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1831, so a year after the Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress, the Cherokee sued the state of Georgia over a law that made Cherokee law in their home sort of null and void, or not enforceable. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that the Cherokee lacked jurisdiction over its land as it was a, quote, domestic dependent nation. And while they possessed some sovereignty, they weren't necessarily considered a foreign nation under the Constitution in order to have some of those rights to bring the lawsuit. And then in the second one, Worcester v. Georgia, this sort of had to do with a white man who sort of lived with the Cherokee, sort of abided by their laws, and once sort of Cherokee Nation v. Georgia was handed down, and we see that the Cherokee Nation isn't sort of viewed as having standing in the court. They turn to this gentleman who they have a relationship with and sort of sort of go to the Supreme Court with him as the plaintiff, and it works. The Supreme Court in 1832 rules that Georgia's laws have no jurisdiction inside Cherokee territory, that the Cherokee had autonomy on their own land, that they could make the rules on their own land, and thus did not necessarily have to comply with Indian removal. However, President Andrew Jackson did not like this Supreme Court ruling and thus ignored the Supreme Court ruling that would sort of allow the Cherokee to stay on their land. And he continued with forcible relocation of Indigenous groups. So even though the Supreme Court basically says, hey, this isn't okay, the Cherokee and thus other Indigenous groups have rights to their land, President Jackson basically said, okay, I don't care, and continued with forcible relocation. So the Trail of Tears does not happen under Andrew Jackson. The Cherokee sort of refused to leave their ancestral homeland. The Supreme Court had sort of been on their side. And so we see that the Cherokee continue to stay in their ancestral homelands. And even after Andrew Jackson leaves office, this is still, the Indian Removal Act is still the law of the land. And Andrew Jackson's predecessor, Martin Van Buren, orders the forcible removal of the Cherokee in 1838. Even though some Cherokee had sort of favored relocation and had sort of almost voluntarily left, in 1838 there are still 18,000 Cherokee on their ancestral homelands, and Martin Van Buren orders the U.S. military to forcibly relocate them to what we now think of as Oklahoma. So we see again a map of lots of these Indigenous groups that are forcibly removed. We see that quote-unquote Indian territory is sort of modern-day Oklahoma here. We see that there's also some settlement in what would become Kansas and Nebraska. But really, as white settlers moved west, it pushed Indigenous groups further and further west. So it's important to sort of pause here and recognize the U.S.'s enforcement of treaties with Indigenous groups. Historically, the U.S. sort of used treaties to sort of try and compensate Indigenous groups for the loss of land and sort of make sure that these groups sort of did have something when being removed. However, we're going to see that the United States does a lot of the time sort of ignore these treaties, changes these treaties when it sort of benefits them. So the United States, as part of the Indian Removal Act, promised American Indian lands and Indian territory, so all of modern-day Oklahoma, that they would remain permanently in Indigenous hands, quote, as long as the grass grows and the water runs. But what we see is that very quickly, as more and more white settlers move west, we see that the United States sort of changes a lot of these treaties to sort of give white settlers sort of preference to that land. So by 1851, new laws sort of start to change land allotment for Indigenous groups. We see that Oklahoma today is not all sovereign land for Indigenous communities. Very little of Oklahoma is actually Indigenous land. But we're also going to see that by 1890, these Indigenous nations are going to lose a lot of legal status in order to try and assimilate those groups into sort of what becomes traditional American society. So in 1851, the Indian Appropriations Act is passed, and it sort of changes the land allotment in Indian Territory, as it is called. So during Indian removal, the Great Plains is really designated as one sort of big reservation for all relocated Indigenous group. However, once white settlers started to expand into that area, Congress sort of revisits this land policy, and they actually create the Indian reservation system that we see today, and sort of provided funds to move Indigenous tribes onto farming reservations. So they really start to lose a lot of their culture that is sort of based around some movement. And so we start to see little by little that the United States starts to sort of chip away at some of the promises that they have made to these groups. So some consequences of Indian removal, we see a large amount of loss of life. 4,000 Cherokee died from malnutrition, exposure, cholera, and harsh treatment on that Trail of Tears. 25% of the Choctaw Nation died en route to Indian Territory between 1831 and 1835. And about 3,500 of 15,000 Creek Nation members died during removal in 1836. So there is an incredible loss of Indigenous life with these forced relocations. And we also see a tremendous loss of ancestral Indigenous land. Indigenous groups lose their land in 8 states to make room for white settlers. And then they will continue to sort of be forced westward onto reservations as the United States expands and grows. So some key takeaways from this video. There was much resistance to this white settlement and removal. Indigenous groups fought back every step of the way to these changes, but no group really, other than maybe the Seminole, were really successful long term. And even the Seminole nation, a lot of them were forcibly removed from their homeland. The Cherokees' autonomy on their land was recognized by the Supreme Court, but we're going to see that Andrew Jackson ignores that ruling and sort of continues with removal. The Indian Removal Act saw the forcible removal of over 100,000 Indigenous individuals, with many dying during the journey. And what we're going to start to see is that the United States sort of routinely starts to violate treaties with Indigenous groups to sort of further their own agenda. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you all later.